Now let's begin a new chapter together, a story of love, destiny, and the beauty of life's unexpected moments. The Seattle Space Needle's observation deck glittered 300 feet above the city, a crown of light and glass that had witnessed countless celebrations. But on this particular evening, as Seattle's elite gathered to celebrate Dale Boucher's 40th birthday, the iconic structure would bear witness to something far darker: betrayal. Dale stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, an untouched glass of Dom Perignon in his hand, watching his reflection overlap with the city lights below. At 40, he cut an impressive figure, 6'2", with shoulders that filled out his custom Tom Ford suit with athletic grace and silver threading tastefully through his dark hair at the temples. Forbes had once called him the most eligible bachelor in the Pacific Northwest, a title that made him wince every time someone mentioned it. They didn't know about the fertility specialists, the failed treatments, or the nights he spent staring at nursery websites, imagining rooms he might never need. The party swirled around him in full swing, Seattle's business elite mingling with his board members and top executives from Premier Technologies, the company he'd built from a startup in his garage to a multi-billion-dollar medical technology empire, now employed over 10,000 people. Their latest innovations in non-invasive surgical equipment were saving lives across the globe. It should have been a night of triumph. "Another amazing year, Dale," Richard Chen, his CFO, raised a glass as he passed. "The Q4 projections are looking better than ever." Dale nodded, his practiced smile sliding into place. Richard had been with him since the beginning, when they worked 80-hour weeks, fueled by nothing but instant ramen and dreams. Now, Richard wore Italian leather shoes and had 3 kids in private school. The thought sent a familiar ache through Dale's chest. The city lights blurred as he remembered his last doctor's appointment. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's voice, gentle but clinical. "The latest treatment wasn't successful, Mr. Boucher. Given your specific condition, I think we need to discuss other options." He'd sat there in her office, surrounded by photos of the families she'd helped create, feeling like the last man on earth. A burst of laughter drew his attention to the bar, where Marcus Wellington held court among a group of investors. Wellington, CEO of Meridian Medical, Premier's biggest competitor, hadn't been invited. His presence set off warning bells in Dale's mind, but confronting him would cause a scene. Besides, several board members seemed quite comfortable with Wellington's impromptu appearance. Wellington caught his eye and raised his glass in a mock toast. The man was everything Dale wasn't. Old money, Yale legacy, third-generation CEO. He'd inherited his company. Dale had built his from nothing. Their rivalry had filled business papers for years, but lately, Wellington's attacks had become more personal. "Dale!" Jennifer Morris, his head of PR, appeared at his elbow. Her smile was too bright, her eyes worried. "Channel 7 wants a statement about the rumors." "What rumors?" The champagne in his hand suddenly felt too warm. "They're saying Meridian is making a play for controlling interest in Premier. Something about private stock sales." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Social media is already picking it up." The glass shattered in Dale's grip before he even realized he'd tightened his hand. Champagne and blood mixed on the imported marble floor. Conversations stuttered to a halt as heads turned toward the sound. "Mr. Boucher." One of the waitstaff hurried over with a towel. Dale barely noticed the sting of the cuts. Through the growing whispers, Wellington's voice carried clearly, "Careful there, Dale." Getting blood on the floors. Very unseemly for a man of your position. The pause was deliberate, the smirk evident in his tone. "Though I suppose a man who can't create a legacy doesn't deserve to run a legacy company." The words hit like physical blows. Dale's private struggles with infertility had been leaked to Wellington somehow. The knowledge he'd tried so desperately to protect was now a weapon in his rival's hands. Looking around the room, Dale saw it in their faces, his board members, his trusted advisors, the slight shifts in posture, the averted gazes. They'd sold him out. While he'd been building the company's future, they'd been secretly selling their shares to Wellington. Blood dripped from his palm, each drop a quiet counterpoint to his racing thoughts. The empire he'd built, the lives his company saved, the jobs he'd created, all of it balanced on a knife's edge because he couldn't do the one thing nature intended, pass on his genes. "Sir," his assistant appeared with the building's first aid kit. "Let me help." "Not now." Dale's voice was ice, his mind already racing through options. He'd need to call an emergency board meeting. His lawyers would have to review the shareholder agreements. The PR team would need to craft a response. But first, he turned to face Wellington, letting his bloody hand drip onto his own ruined suit. Let them see it. Let them see that he could bleed and still stand. "A legacy?" Dale's voice carried across the suddenly silent observation deck. "Let me tell you about legacy, Marcus. Legacy isn't about DNA. It's not about passing on shares or inheriting Daddy's company. Each word was precisely chosen, pitched to carry to every corner. Legacy is about impact. How many lives have your inherited patents saved this year? How many surgeons are using your equipment in developing countries? How many of your employees' children are attending college because of your stock options program?" He stepped forward, and despite the blood, despite the whispers, his presence filled the room. "You want to talk about creating things? I created hope for patients who had none. I created jobs for people who needed them. I created solutions to problems your R&D team said were impossible." His smile was sharp as broken glass. "And if you think you can take that away with some backroom deals and cheap shots about my personal life, you don't understand what the word legacy means." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the city below seemed to hold its breath. Wellington's smirk faltered for just a moment. Bold words from a man about to lose his company. "The board votes tomorrow, Dale. Maybe spend less time making speeches and more time counting your remaining shares." Dale looked at his bleeding hand, then at the faces around him, some guilty, some afraid, some calculating their next move. He'd built this company from nothing once. If necessary, he'd do it again. "Jennifer," he called to his PR head, pitching his voice to Carrie. "Call a press conference for tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. And get me Dr. Amit Patel from the Bloomberg School of Public Health on the line tonight." He turned to Wellington. "You want to play hardball? Fine, but remember, I didn't inherit my fighting skills. I earned them." He strode toward the elevator, his bloody hand held high enough to ensure it would stain his custom suit. Let the photos hit social media. Let them see that Dale Boucher didn't hide his wounds. He wore them like battle flags. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Before stepping in, Dale turned back one last time. "Oh, and Marcus. Happy birthday to me." The doors closed on Wellington's reddening face, and Dale finally let his mask crack. Alone in the descending elevator, he watched drops of blood stain his birthday card from the board. Too many more years of success suddenly reading like a funeral notice. His phone buzzed. Dr. Patel accepting his call for later. Good. The world thought Dale Boucher was fighting to save his company tonight. They weren't entirely wrong. But as he pressed his bleeding hand against his chest, feeling his heart hammer against his palm, Dale knew he was fighting for something far more precious. The chance to prove that a man's worth wasn't measured by his ability to reproduce, but by his capacity to create change in the world. The elevator reached the ground floor, and Dale straightened his spine. His mother, before cancer took her too early, had always told him, "Steel isn't strong because it never breaks. It's strong because it can bend without shattering." Tonight he had bent. Tomorrow he would show them all what it meant to be forged in fire. As he stepped out into the Seattle night, rain beginning to fall like nature's own commentary on his 40th birthday, Dale made himself a promise. Whether he had children of his own or not, his legacy would be measured in the lives he touched, the changes he created, and the hope he built. And no one, not Marcus Wellington, not his traitorous board, not even his own body's limitations, would take that away from him. The city stretched before him, its lights blurred by rain and unshed tears. Somewhere in this vast maze of steel and dreams, his future was waiting. He just had to survive tonight to find it. Blood still dripping, heart still beating, Dale Boucher walked into the rain-soaked night, leaving his 40th birthday party behind and walking toward a destiny he couldn't yet imagine. One that would prove that the greatest legacies aren't inherited or even created. They're earned, one impossible victory at a time. And as the Space Needle disappeared into the mist behind him, Dale allowed himself a real smile for the first time that night. Tomorrow's battle would be legendary, and he was just getting started. The rain washed the blood from his hand, but his determination only grew stronger with each step. Sometimes, he realized, you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find what you truly need. He just didn't know yet that his greatest legacy wasn't waiting in a boardroom or a laboratory. It was waiting in a hospital nursery where fate and a tired nurse named Bethany Sweet were about to rewrite everything he thought he knew about power, legacy, and the true meaning of creating something miraculous. But that was tomorrow's story. Tonight he had a war to plan, and Dale Boucher had never lost a war he chose to fight. Chapter 2. Angels in Scrubs. The resignation letter sat in Bethany Sweet's locker like a loaded gun. 3 drafts, each more diplomatic than the last, all saying the same thing. 15 years of pediatric nursing had hollowed her out. The latest version, printed on crisp white paper, waited beside her spare scrubs, and the family photo she couldn't bring herself to take down. Her parents on their last Christmas together, before the car accident that left her and her twin sister in the foster system. Seattle Children's Hospital hummed around her at 2 a.m., that peculiar quiet that always felt more like held breath than peace. The pediatric intensive care unit's monitors created their usual symphony of beeps and alerts, a rhythm Bethany could interpret in her sleep. Tonight was supposed to be her last night shift. She'd already accepted a position at a private clinic, regular hours, better pay, no more watching children fight battles they couldn't possibly understand. Nurse Sweet. Amanda, one of the new residents, poked her head into the break room. Your little fighter in 302 is asking for you, says he can't sleep without his special story. Bethany smiled despite her exhaustion. Tommy, age 6, recovering from his 3rd heart surgery. He'd memorized every word of Where the Wild Things Are, but insisted only she could read it properly. Tell him I'll be there in 5 minutes, Bethany said, reaching for her coffee. The resignation letter could wait another hour. She never made it to Tommy's room. The first code blue alert came at 2:17 a.m., then another, then another. Before the 3rd one finished echoing through the halls, Bethany was running toward the emergency department, her coffee forgotten, her body moving on pure instinct. School bus rolled on I-5, Dr. Patel announced as staff poured in from every direction. 20 children, ages 5 to 11. First ambulance is 3 minutes out. This is not a drill, people. The emergency department transformed like a creature waking from hibernation. Trauma bays were cleared, equipment was checked, blood was ordered. Bethany felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, her earlier exhaustion burning away in the face of immediate need. The first ambulance arrived with a sound like thunder. Paramedics burst through the doors with a stretcher that seemed too large for its tiny occupant. A girl, no more than 7, her blonde hair matted with blood, her Wonder Woman backpack still strapped to her chest. Multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding, BP dropping. The paramedic rattled off stats as they moved. She's been asking for her mom. Bethany fell into step beside the stretcher, her hand finding the girl's. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Nurse Bethany. Can you tell me your name?" "Lucy," the child whispered through tears. "I want my mommy." "I know, honey. We're going to find her. Right now, I need you to be brave like Wonder Woman, okay? Can you do that for me?" Lucy's tiny fingers tightened around Bethany's as they wheeled her into Trauma Bay 1. And just like that, Bethany's world narrowed to this single point of contact. This one child, this one moment, this one battle. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of motion and desperate needs. More ambulances arrived, more children, more tears, more tiny hands reaching for comfort. Bethany moved from bed to bed, her skills on autopilot, while her heart broke and reformed with each new patient. At some point she found herself in Trauma Bay 3, helping to stabilize a boy with a collapsed lung. His dark eyes locked onto hers as Dr. Patel inserted the chest tube, and Bethany sang softly, an old lullaby her mother used to use, the one that always calmed the most frightened children. "You have a beautiful voice," a deep voice commented from behind her. Bethany turned, ready to ask whoever it was to leave the Trauma Bay, and found herself staring at Dale Boucher. The Dale Boucher, CEO of Premier Technologies, whose face she'd seen on countless magazine covers and news reports. He stood in the doorway wearing what had to be a bespoke suit, though it was rumpled now, and his right hand was bandaged. "Mr. Boucher, this is a restricted area," she started, but he held up his uninjured hand. "I know, I'm sorry. I was dropping off some equipment donations when I heard about the accident. I thought maybe I could help." There was something in his voice, a roughness, a vulnerability that made Bethany pause. The media painted him as a cold-hearted corporate titan, but the man before her looked lost, haunted even. Before she could respond, the boy on the bed whimpered. Instantly, Dale stepped forward, pulling something from his jacket pocket, a small stuffed dragon. "Hey there, warrior," he said softly, placing the dragon next to the boy's hand. "This is Blaze. He's very brave, just like you. Would you like to hear his story?" The boy nodded slightly, careful of his chest tube. And to Bethany's amazement, Dale Boucher, the billionaire CEO, pulled up a chair and began spinning a tale about a dragon who was afraid to fly until he learned that courage wasn't about not being scared. It was about flying anyway. Bethany found herself caught between monitoring her patient and watching this unexpected scene unfold. Dale's voice was gentle, his story simple but engaging. The boy's vital signs steadily improved as he listened, his small hand clutching the dragon. Over the next few hours, Dale moved from room to room, distributing stuffed animals and stories. He seemed to have an endless supply of both. Bethany kept crossing paths with him, each time noticing something new, the way his hands shook slightly when he touched the children's beds, the sadness in his eyes when he looked at the worried parents, the genuine warmth of his smile when a child hugged their new toy. At 3 a.m., she found him in the family waiting area, sitting with Lucy's mother, who had finally arrived. The woman was sobbing into her hands, and Dale was simply there, his presence somehow both powerful and gentle, offering silent support. "She's stable," Bethany announced, and watched both adults look up. "The surgery went well. She's asking for you, Mrs. Parker." As Lucy's mother rushed past to see her daughter, Dale stood, swaying slightly. Bethany noticed the shadows under his eyes, the way he favored his injured hand. "When did you last eat?" she asked, her nurse's instincts kicking in. He blinked, seemingly surprised by the question. "I don't remember." "Come on," she said, making a decision. "The cafeteria's closed, but we have decent coffee and sandwiches in the staff room." He followed her without argument, which told her more about his exhaustion than words could. The break room was empty, everyone else still dealing with the crisis. Bethany found herself making coffee and unwrapping sandwiches for a billionaire at 3 a.m., and somehow it felt perfectly natural. "Why are you really here?" she asked as she handed him a cup. "The truth, please. I've had enough PR speaks from hospital administrators to last a lifetime." Dale stared into his coffee for a long moment. "I couldn't sleep," he finally said. "Had a difficult evening. Saw the news about the accident. Thought maybe I could be useful here instead of staring at my ceiling." With an injured hand and wearing what looks like a $4,000 suit. $5,000, he corrected with a hint of a smile. "And the hand, that's part of the difficult evening." Bethany sat across from him, noting the way he cradled the cup, the slight tremor in his fingers. "You're shaking. When did you last sleep?" "Sleep is overrated," he murmured, but his eyes met hers, and suddenly the air between them felt charged with something she couldn't name. "You're supposed to be asking why the cold-hearted CEO is sitting in a hospital at 3 a.m. telling stories to sick kids." "No," Bethany said softly. "I'm not asking that at all. I can see why you're here. Same reason I am. Sometimes the only way to heal yourself is to help heal others." Dale's cup froze halfway to his lips. For a moment, he looked utterly exposed, as if she'd read something in his soul he thought he'd hidden completely. "How did you—" 15 years of pediatric nursing," she said. "You learn to read people, their pain, their fears, their hopes." She gestured to his bandaged hand, their wounds, both visible and hidden. A child's cry echoed from somewhere in the unit. Both of them tensed, ready to move, and their eyes met in shared understanding. "I should go," Dale said, standing. "Thank you for the coffee." "And for—" "Not asking," Bethany suggested. "Seeing," he corrected quietly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out one last stuffed dragon, placing it on the break room table. "For your next patient who needs a friend." Their fingers brushed as he set down the toy, and Bethany felt something like electricity spark between them. Dale's eyes widened slightly, telling her he'd felt it too. "Ms. Sweet ... "Bethany," she corrected. "Bethany," he said, her name somehow sounding different in his voice. "Would you—" Another cry interrupted them, this one more urgent. Bethany was moving before she could think, her body responding to the sound of a child in distress. But at the door, she turned back. "I'm here every night this week," she said, surprising herself. "The coffee's always terrible, but the company tonight wasn't bad at all." Dale's smile transformed his entire face, erasing the corporate mask she knew from magazines, revealing something warmer, more real. "I may have more stuffed animals to deliver," he said. "It could take several nights." Then they were both moving, pulled back into the chaos of the emergency department. But as Bethany worked through the rest of her shift, she found herself thinking of sad eyes and gentle hands, of dragons and courage, of wounds both visible and hidden. The resignation letter in her locker seemed to fade from importance with each passing hour. By the time dawn painted the Seattle sky in shades of hope, Bethany knew she wouldn't be delivering it. Some callings couldn't be walked away from, just as some connections couldn't be ignored. She didn't know then that her life had just changed irrevocably. She didn't know that the man with the sad eyes and expensive suit would rewrite her understanding of love and legacy. She didn't know that somewhere between midnight and dawn, between tragedy and hope, between coffee and stuffed dragons, she'd stumbled into the beginning of her own miracle. But she did know one thing. Tomorrow night, she'd make sure they had better coffee in the break room, just in case another sleepless billionaire needed a place to heal his hidden wounds. As she finally left the hospital, the morning sun warming her face, Bethany touched the stuffed dragon in her pocket. Sometimes the biggest miracles started with the smallest gestures. Sometimes healing began with a story about a dragon learning to fly, and sometimes, just sometimes, angels wore custom suits instead of scrubs. Chapter 3. Battlefield of Trust. The evidence wall in Bethany's apartment told two stories, the one she was investigating and the one breaking her heart. Premier Technologies' financials and incident reports created a complex web on her left wall, connected by red strings and sticky notes. But it was her right wall that haunted her. Candid photos of Dale reading to sick children, security footage of him delivering toys at midnight, newspaper clippings of his charity work that never made the front pages. Her HAP badge sat like an accusation on her desk as she stood in her date dress, still wearing the earrings Dale had sent that morning. The small box had arrived with a note. "These belonged to my mother. She wore them when she taught me that love is an action, not just a feeling. Will you wear them to dinner?" The earrings caught the light as Bethany traced a photo of Dale at a children's cancer ward. His public smile was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his face showed raw empathy as he held a crying child. Her fingers trembled as she touched the image. How could this man be the corporate villain she'd been sent to expose? Their first date had started as a tactical mission. Take him to dinner, gain his trust, find proof of corporate fraud. Instead, it had exploded into their first battle, not against each other, but for something bigger than both of them. $300,000 for a basic heart valve. Bethany had challenged over appetizers at Seattle's most exclusive restaurant. How do you justify that to families who can't afford it? Instead of defensive corporate speak, Dale had pulled out his laptop right there between the wine glasses. For 2 hours, he'd walked her through Premier's global initiative, how they used profits from wealthy markets to fund programs in developing countries. She'd watched him light up explaining how they'd revolutionized delivery systems in rural Africa, developed solar-powered diagnostic tools for remote clinics, trained local doctors in cutting-edge procedures. "The valve costs us $50,000 to make," he'd admitted. "We charge more in America so we can give them away in countries that can't afford them. Last year alone, we provided free cardiac care to over 10,000 children worldwide." Their argument had turned into a passionate discussion about healthcare ethics, global access, and the balance between profit and purpose. She'd left that night with her mission compromised and her heart traitorously intrigued. Their second date wasn't supposed to happen, but when a major snowstorm hit Seattle, trapping half her nursing staff at home, Dale had shown up at the hospital with his sleeves already rolled up. "I may run a company," he'd said, helping her change bedding in the pediatric ward, "but I still remember how to make a hospital corner. Mom made sure of that during her chemo days." She'd watched him that night, not as an investigator, but as a nurse. Watched how gentle his hands were with fragile patients, how he remembered every child's name, every parent's concern, how his corporate mask slipped when he thought no one was looking, revealing a deep well of carefully hidden pain. Now, standing in her apartment before their third date, Bethany faced her reflection in the window. The earrings Dale's mother had worn sparkled against her neck, beautiful and damning. On her desk, her latest report to HAP remained unfinished. Subject shows concerning patterns in testing protocols. Her phone buzzed, a text from Dale, just past the children's ward. "Tommy asked me to tell you his heart feels super good today." His words, but I agree with the sentiment. "My heart feels pretty super too, knowing I'll see you soon." Bethany sank into her chair, the weight of her dual life suddenly crushing. Every document she'd gathered showed suspicious patterns, but nothing concrete. Every lead she'd followed led to dead ends or to more evidence of Dale's humanitarian work. It was like trying to prove darkness lived in the heart of light. A knock at her door made her jump. Dale was early. She quickly covered her evidence walls with the curtains she'd installed for this purpose, smoothed her dress, and opened the door. Dale stood there in a perfectly tailored suit, holding a small gift bag and wearing a smile that made her heart stutter. But it was his eyes that undid her, vulnerable, hopeful, carrying a warmth that no corporate CEO should possess. "I brought something for you," he said softly, "for when you have rough days at the hospital." Inside the bag was a teddy bear wearing scrubs, but it was what the bear held that made her throat tight. A miniature version of Where the Wild Things Are, Tommy's favorite book. "I had it custom-made," Dale explained, suddenly seeming nervous. "The bear's scrubs have your name, and the book. I thought maybe on hard days you could remember how your voice sounds reading it, how you make scared children feel safe just by being you." In that moment, Bethany's carefully constructed walls cracked. How could she investigate this man who noticed when she was tired during rounds, who remembered which children needed extra stories, who carried other people's pain so carefully while hiding his own? "Dale," she started, not sure if she was going to confess everything or run away. But then his phone rang, an emergency board meeting. Something about irregularities in the testing data. Her heart froze. This was what she'd been waiting for, wasn't it? Evidence of corporate wrongdoing. "I have to go," he said apologetically. "But dinner tomorrow? There's something I need to tell you, something I've been afraid to share." She nodded, watching him hurry away. As soon as he was gone, she plugged the drive containing her latest surveillance into her laptop. Boardroom cameras captured Dale pacing in his office, his hands shaking as he popped pills she recognized as anti-anxiety medication. His phone conversations revealed not corporate fraud, but desperate attempts to understand why test results weren't matching across facilities. "Run the tests again," he ordered his head of research. "Every protocol, every safeguard. These devices save lives. We can't risk any mistakes." Bethany's own hands shook as she added the footage to her evidence wall. But which wall did it belong on? The one documenting potential crimes, or the one showing a man whose integrity ran soul deep? Her HAP supervisor's words echoed in her mind. "Find the smoking gun, Bethany. Every corporation has its dark side, even ones run by men who read to sick children. But what if they were wrong? What if, in their determination to find corruption, they'd targeted the one CEO who valued lives over profits?" Her phone buzzed again, another text from Dale. "I'm sorry about tonight, but I need you to know something. Meeting you, it's made me believe in impossible things again, in hope, in trust, in the kind of love my mother said was worth fighting for." Bethany touched the earrings she wore, feeling their weight like truth against her skin. Tomorrow she would have to decide, her mission or her heart, the evidence she'd gathered or the evidence of her own eyes, the investigator's path or the harder road of trust. But tonight, in her apartment with its walls of contradiction, she allowed herself to feel the full complexity of loving someone she was meant to destroy. Because sometimes, the greatest battles weren't fought with weapons or evidence or corporate power. Sometimes they were fought in the space between duty and desire, between facts and faith, between the head that knew to be cautious and the heart that recognized its own truth in another's eyes. And sometimes, just sometimes, love wasn't a battlefield at all. It was a surrender to something stronger than doubt, more powerful than fear, and more true than any evidence wall could ever capture. Chapter 4. The Night. Everything changed. The Seattle Children's Hospital Foundation Gala transformed the Grand Hyatt's ballroom into a garden of silver and blue lights. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic patterns across evening gowns and tuxedos, while ice sculptures of children playing sparkled like frozen dreams. At the center of it all, Bethany Sweet stood in a midnight blue gown that seemed to capture starlight, her heart pounding with the weight of the USB drive hidden in her clutch. 2 hours earlier, she'd discovered the truth. The evidence had been buried in encrypted files on Meridian Medical's servers, files that her HAP colleagues had finally cracked. Marcus Wellington hadn't just fabricated evidence against Premier Technologies. He'd orchestrated a years-long campaign to destroy Dale Boucher, starting with leaked medical records about Dale's infertility treatments. Now, watching Dale work the room in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, Bethany felt torn between urgency and heartbreak. He moved with practiced ease among Seattle's elite, but she could see the cost in the tension of his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hand as he lifted his champagne glass. Each smile looked more forced than the last. "Ms. Sweet." Marcus Wellington's voice behind her carried all the warmth of a snake's belly. "What a pleasure to see our favorite nurse supporting such a worthy cause." Bethany turned, her grip tightening on her clutch. Wellington wore his usual predatory smile, but there was something sharp in his eyes as they darted between her and Dale. "Mr. Wellington," she acknowledged coolly. "I wasn't aware Meridian Medical had been invited tonight." "Oh, we're everywhere these days." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Rather like certain healthcare watchdog organizations. Don't you agree?" The threat in his words was unmistakable. Somehow he knew about HAP, about her investigation. The USB drive felt suddenly heavy, its contents burning with newfound urgency. "If you'll excuse me," Bethany began, but Wellington's hand shot out, gripping her arm with casual cruelty. "You know," he said conversationally, "it's fascinating how often Dale's companions turn out to be more than they appear. One might almost think he has a type, women who betray him. Let go of me." Bethany's voice was steel, matching the strength she'd learned in 15 years of handling hospital emergencies. "Bethany!" Dale's voice cut through the tension. He appeared at her side, his expression darkening as he saw Wellington's grip on her arm. "Take your hand off her, Marcus. Now." Wellington released her with exaggerated courtesy, but his smile had turned vicious. "Just having a friendly chat about loyalty, Dale. Something you should understand quite well by now." The orchestra struck up a new song, the opening notes of "The Way You Look Tonight" floating through the ballroom. Dale's hand found the small of Bethany's back, protective and gentle. "Dance with me?" he asked her, though his eyes never left Wellington's face. She nodded, letting him guide her to the dance floor. His touch was tentative, as if he feared she might shatter, or perhaps he was the one in danger of breaking. "Are you all right?" he murmured as they began to move with the music. "I need to tell you something," Bethany whispered back. "Something important. Not here. Somewhere private." Dale's steps faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "My office is 2 buildings over. We can take the private elevator." The song ended too quickly. They made their excuses to the hospital board members, Dale smoothly explaining that he needed to check some donor documents. No one questioned it. Dale Boucher's workaholic tendencies were legendary. The night air hit them like a shock as they crossed the sky bridge connecting the hotel to Premier's Tower. Seattle's lights sparkled below, a mirror of the stars above. Bethany's heels clicked against marble as they entered the executive elevator lobby. Dale pressed his thumb to the biometric scanner, and the elevator doors slid open silently. They stepped inside together, the air between them charged with unspoken words. "Dale," Bethany began as the elevator started to rise, "I haven't been completely honest with you." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I know." Before she could respond, the elevator lurched violently. Lights flickered, then died. Emergency lights cast everything in an eerie blue glow as the car ground to a halt between floors. "Perfect timing," Dale muttered, reaching for the emergency phone. Dead silence met his attempt. No signal on my cell either. Bethany checked her own phone. Nothing. They were suspended 30 stories up, cut off from the world, with only battery-powered lights between them and darkness. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. Dale loosened his bow tie, suddenly looking exhausted. "About Hap?" "3 weeks. About you being their investigator?" 2 weeks. About Wellington's involvement, that I just figured out tonight watching him watch you. Why didn't you say anything?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Why didn't you? We've both been keeping secrets, Bethany. I just never expected mine to hurt quite this much." The pain in his voice cut through her defenses. She opened her clutch, removing the USB drive. "I found evidence tonight. Wellington fabricated everything. The patient complaints, the testing irregularities. It was all Meridian, not Premier. He's been systematically destroying evidence and planting false leads for years." Dale stared at the tiny drive as if it might bite him. "Why? Why help me now?" "Because I know you," Bethany said softly. "The real you, not the CEO in magazines or the target of my investigation. I know how you sing off-key to scared children, how you remember every nurse's birthday, how your hands shake when you think no one's watching, but you never let it stop you from holding a crying child." She stepped closer, her heart pounding. "I know how you kiss like you're afraid of breaking something precious. How you look at families in the pediatric ward with such longing it hurts to watch. How you build empires but still carry stuffed animals in your car just in case a child needs comfort." Dale's breath caught. In the blue emergency light, she could see tears in his eyes. "You weren't supposed to be real," he whispered. "After Julia died, I swore I'd never trust anyone again." "Julia? My wife. Former wife. She was Wellington's sister." The words seemed to cost him physical pain. "She married me when Premier was just starting, filed for divorce the day after we got the first major FDA approval, called my infertility a convenient business liability. She'd been feeding information to Marcus the entire time." Understanding dawned like a bitter sunrise. "That's why Wellington's attacks got so personal. He had inside information about your medical history." Dale leaned back against the elevator wall, sliding down until he sat on the floor, his perfect tuxedo wrinkled, his carefully maintained facade cracking. "I thought I was protecting myself, keeping people at a distance. Then you walked into my life with your terrible coffee and beautiful heart, and suddenly all my walls meant nothing." Bethany sat beside him, close enough to feel his warmth, but not touching. "I took this assignment because I believed corporations were putting profits over patients. I lost my parents to medical negligence, watching them die because some company decided their treatment was too expensive. It broke something in me. I swore I'd never let it happen to anyone else." "I remember the first time I saw you in the hospital," Dale said softly. "You were singing to that little boy with the collapsed lung. Your voice wasn't particularly good." She laughed despite herself. "Thanks a lot. But it was real," he continued. "Everything about you was real. The way you cared, the way you fought for your patients, the way you challenged me about healthcare costs on our first date. I kept waiting to find the agenda, the angle, the betrayal. Instead, I found you." Bethany's hand found his in the dim light. "I kept waiting to find evidence that you were the villain in my story. Instead, I found a man who loses sleep worrying about sick children, who builds hospitals in countries that can't afford them, who carries wounds so deep he thinks he has to hide them from the world." Dale's fingers interlaced with hers. "I have panic attacks," he admitted quietly. "Started after Julia left. The board doesn't know. No one knows. Except you. You noticed in that board meeting last week, didn't you? When you suggested we take a coffee break right as it was starting. Your left hand always shakes first," Bethany said. "And you get a certain look in your eyes, like you're drowning but trying to pretend you can breathe underwater. How do you see me so clearly?" The same way you see me. She turned to face him fully. I was going to resign from HAP tonight. Before I found the evidence, I chose you weeks ago, Dale. The truth just gave me a better way to protect you. He reached up with his free hand, cupping her face. I should be angry. I should feel betrayed. Instead, I just feel free, she finished for him. Their lips met in the blue darkness, but this kiss was different from all the others. This was truth meeting truth, broken pieces fitting together. Two souls, recognizing their matching scars. Dale's hands trembled as they tangled in her hair, but Bethany just held him closer, letting him feel that she was real, that she wasn't leaving, that some things were worth the risk of trust. The elevator lights flickered back to life, but they barely noticed. In that suspended moment between earth and sky, something fundamental had shifted. All their carefully constructed walls had crumbled, leaving only the raw, beautiful truth of two people who had found home in each other's broken places. Later, they would face Wellington's schemes together. Later, they would build something extraordinary from the ashes of their secrets. Later, they would learn that their biggest miracle was still waiting to surprise them. But in that moment, in an elevator caught between floors, they discovered that sometimes the greatest power isn't in keeping secrets. It's in finding someone strong enough to help you carry their weight. And sometimes love isn't about being perfect. It's about being perfectly honest about your imperfections. The night had changed everything. But then again, maybe everything had been changing since the moment a tired nurse and a lonely CEO found each other in a hospital at 3 a.m., both thinking they were broken beyond repair, both about to discover that the best love stories start with two people brave enough to let their guards down and their hearts open, even if it takes a stuck elevator to make it happen. Chapter 5. Storm Warnings. The pregnancy test sat on Bethany's bathroom counter like a live grenade. 3 minutes had never felt so long. Outside, Seattle's infamous rain pelted her apartment windows, providing a drumbeat to her racing thoughts. 2 weeks of morning sickness she'd attributed to stress. The unexpected dizziness during hospital rounds. The strange cravings for foods she normally hated. Her phone buzzed. Dale was on his way over. She'd called him in a panic after nearly fainting during her shift, and he'd immediately left a board meeting. That was 20 minutes ago. Now, staring at the plastic stick that could change everything, she wondered if she should have waited to tell him. The timer on her phone chimed just as thunder cracked overhead. With trembling hands, she picked up the test. Positive. The world tilted sideways. She grabbed the counter for support, her mind racing through impossibilities. Dale's infertility wasn't just a medical fact. It had been confirmed by multiple specialists over years of testing. The most recent doctor had been brutally clear: the chance of natural conception is effectively zero. Yet here she was, staring at two pink lines that defied medical science. A knock at her door made her jump. She quickly hid the test in her pocket and went to let Dale in. He stood in her doorway, his suit slightly damp from the rain, his face etched with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked immediately, stepping inside and cupping her face in his hands. "Jennifer said you looked pale at the hospital. Have you seen a doctor?" Bethany leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his presence. "I need to show you something," she whispered. "But you should sit down first." Dale's expression shifted from concern to worry. "Bethany, what's wrong?" Instead of answering, she led him to her couch and pulled the pregnancy test from her pocket. For a moment he just stared at it, uncomprehending. Then his face went completely white. But that's not possible," he whispered. "The doctors said—" "I know." Bethany sat beside him, taking his trembling hand. "I took 3 tests, all positive." Dale's breathing became shallow, and she recognized the signs of an impending panic attack. Quickly, she knelt in front of him, taking both his hands. "Breathe with me," she instructed softly. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. Stay with me, love." Gradually, his breathing steadied, but his hands still shook in hers. "How?" he managed finally. "I don't know," Bethany admitted. "But I made an appointment with Dr. Sarah Mitchell for tomorrow morning. She's the best reproductive specialist in the city." "I remember her," Dale said quietly. "She was the one who told me." His voice cracked. "She was kind about it, but very clear. The damage from my childhood illness, combined with the experimental treatments, she said a natural pregnancy would be statistically impossible." Thunder rumbled again, closer this time. The storm was intensifying, matching the turbulent emotions in the room. "Will you come with me tomorrow?" Bethany asked softly. Dale pulled her up onto the couch beside him, wrapping her in his arms. "Try to stop me," he murmured into her hair. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the storm and holding each other. Eventually, Dale's hand drifted to her stomach, resting there with a touch so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. "If this is real," he whispered, "if this is actually happening, ... It's terrifying," Bethany finished for him. "And wonderful," he added, "and impossible, and perfect." The next morning dawned grey and cold. Dr. Mitchell's office was on the top floor of Seattle's most prestigious medical building, with views of the Space Needle that neither of them noticed. They were too focused on the ultrasound screen, where Dr. Mitchell was frowning in concentration. "This is..." she began, then stopped, adjusting something on the machine. "What's wrong?" Dale's grip on Bethany's hand tightened. Dr. Mitchell turned to them with an expression of complete amazement. "Nothing's wrong, but I'm seeing something extraordinary. There aren't just two heartbeats." "Twins," Bethany whispered. "No." Dr. Mitchell turned the screen toward them. "Quadruplets, two sets of identical twins, all with strong heartbeats." The room seemed to spin. Dale sat down hard in the nearest chair, while Bethany stared at the screen in shock. That's impossible," Dale managed finally. "Apparently not." Dr. Mitchell's voice was gentle, but excited. "Mr. Boucher, given your medical history, this is unprecedented. The odds against natural conception were astronomical. The odds against quadruplets, especially two sets of identical twins. I've never seen anything like this in my entire career." She spent the next hour walking them through what this meant. High-risk pregnancy, constant monitoring, possible bed rest, the risks and challenges ahead of them. But Dale and Bethany were only half listening. Their eyes kept returning to the screen, to the four tiny heartbeats that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. They were so absorbed in their miracle that they didn't notice Dr. Mitchell's assistant stepping out to take a phone call. Didn't realize that news this extraordinary couldn't stay secret for long. The storm broke as they left the medical building. Dale was already on the phone with his legal team, setting up trust funds, arranging for the best maternal fetal medicine specialists. Bethany was texting her supervisor at the hospital, requesting a meeting to discuss adjusting her schedule. Neither of them saw the photographer hiding behind a newspaper stand. Neither of them noticed the man in the grey suit who'd been watching Dr. Mitchell's office all morning. The first headline hit social media within hours. "Miracle or manipulation? Premier tech CEO's impossible pregnancy raises questions." Dale saw it first, during a meeting with his executive team. His phone had been buzzing continuously with notifications, but he'd ignored them until Jennifer, his PR director, burst into the room, looking pale. "Dale, you need to see this, now." The article was brutal. Someone had leaked Dale's complete medical history, including details of experimental fertility treatments he'd investigated years ago. Wellington's fingerprints were all over it, though proving that would be nearly impossible. The implications were clear. Premier Technologies had used its CEO as a test subject for unauthorized fertility treatments, raising questions about the company's ethical standards and research protocols. Dale's phone rang. Bethany. "Turn on the news," she said without preamble. Her voice was shaking. He grabbed the remote for his office TV just in time to see Marcus Wellington being interviewed outside Meridian Medical's headquarters. "These allegations are deeply concerning," Wellington was saying, his face a mask of false concern. "If Premier Technologies is conducting unauthorized human trials, especially on its own CEO, one has to wonder what other ethical lines they're willing to cross. The FDA should investigate immediately." The camera cut to shots of Dale and Bethany leaving Dr. Mitchell's office that morning, then to carefully selected clips from Dale's past interviews about Premier's research division. Out of context, perfectly edited to sound sinister. "I'm coming to get you," Dale told Bethany, already grabbing his coat. "Pack a bag. We're going somewhere safe until we can contain this." "No." Bethany's voice was stronger now. "We're not running. I have evidence, remember? Everything Wellington's done, every lie he's told, it's all documented. We fight back, today." Dale stopped, his coat half on. "Bethany, the stress, the babies." "We'll be fine," she said firmly, "because their father is going to show the world what real integrity looks like, and their mother is done watching bad men hurt good people." In that moment, Dale fell in love with her all over again. "Where do we start?" "Call a press conference," Bethany said. "I'll bring the evidence. It's time to show Wellington that some miracles don't need scientific explanation. They just need truth and courage." Thunder rolled outside Dale's office window, but this time it felt less like a warning and more like applause. The storm was here, but they would weather it together, because some things were worth fighting for. And the love, strong enough to create impossible miracles, was definitely one of them. What they didn't know yet was that their biggest battle was still ahead. But for now, they had each other, 4 tiny heartbeats, and the kind of truth that could weather any storm. Wellington had declared war on their miracle, but he was about to learn that some things were beyond the reach of corporate warfare. Some things were simply meant to be. And sometimes the most powerful weapon against darkness isn't money or influence or carefully crafted lies. Sometimes it's just love. Pure, impossible, miracle-making love. The kind that creates life where science says it can't exist. The kind that turns enemies into dust and transforms ordinary moments into magic. The kind that writes its own rules and defies every rational explanation. The kind that was growing inside Bethany, 4 tiny proofs that the heart knows things logic can never understand. The storm was just beginning, but so was their greatest adventure, and they were ready for both. Chapter 6. Love's Testimony. The Premier Technologies press room had never been so crowded. Journalists packed every seat, with more standing along the walls, their cameras and phones creating a forest of electronic eyes. The air hummed with speculation. Why had Dale Boucher called an emergency press conference? Was he stepping down? Would he address the brewing scandal about unauthorized fertility treatments? Behind the stage, Bethany stood in front of a mirror, smoothing her navy dress over her still flat stomach. The evidence was loaded on a secure tablet, triple-checked and backed up. Her HP badge sat heavy in her pocket, a reminder of everything she was about to risk. "Are you sure about this?" Dale asked softly, appearing behind her. He looked exhausted, but determined in his charcoal suit, the one she'd once teased him about being his battle armor. "No," Bethany admitted, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "But I'm sure about you, about us, about them." Her hand drifted to her stomach, where their 4 impossible miracles grew stronger each day. Dale's arms slipped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. Whatever happens out there, know that you've already given me more than I ever dreamed possible. Save the sweet talk for after I blow up my career, she teased, but her voice wavered. Your career will be fine, he promised. I've already had offers from 3 research hospitals wanting to study our case. They're more interested in the medical miracle than the corporate warfare. A knock at the door interrupted them. Jennifer, Dale's PR director, poked her head in. They're ready, and Wellington just arrived with his legal team. Perfect, Bethany smiled, but it was a predator's smile. Let's give him a front-row seat to his own downfall. The lights were blinding as they walked onto the stage. Dale took his usual place at the podium, while Bethany sat in a chair to his right, her tablet ready in her lap. She could see Wellington in the front row, looking smugly confident. Thank you all for coming, Dale began, his voice steady. Before we address the recent allegations about Premier Technologies' research protocols, there's something else we need to discuss, a truth that's been hidden for too long. He turned to Bethany, extending his hand. She rose and joined him at the podium, her heart pounding but her spine steel straight. My name is Bethany Sweet, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. For the past 6 months, I've been working undercover for the Healthcare Accountability Project, investigating allegations of corporate fraud at Premier Technologies. The room erupted in gasps and camera clicks. Wellington's smirk grew wider until Bethany continued. What I found wasn't what anyone expected. The fraud existed, but not at Premier. The evidence led somewhere else entirely. She picked up her tablet, and the screen behind her came to life with documents, emails, and financial records. It led to Meridian Medical and Marcus Wellington. The smirk vanished from Wellington's face as Bethany methodically laid out her case. The falsified test results, the doctored patient complaints, the systematic campaign to destroy Premier's reputation. But the most damaging evidence, Bethany continued, her voice growing harder, was personal. Mr. Wellington didn't just attack Premier Technologies. He used private medical information about Dale Boucher's infertility treatments to orchestrate a smear campaign. Information he obtained illegally through his sister's marriage to Dale years ago. Wellington stood abruptly, his face mottled with rage. This is slander. You have no proof. Actually, Dale cut in smoothly, we have your own emails. He nodded to Jennifer, who clicked to the next slide. Wellington's private correspondence filled the screen, including messages about using Dale's medical history as leverage. You didn't count on one thing, Marcus, Dale said quietly. You didn't count on love being stronger than hate. Bethany took over again, her voice steady, despite the tears in her eyes. I came to Premier looking for a villain. Instead, I found a man who spends his free evenings reading to sick children, who builds hospitals in countries that can't afford them, who carries the weight of 10,000 employees' livelihoods on his shoulders, but still notices when a nurse is having a bad day. She turned to face Dale fully now, speaking to him rather than the cameras. I found a man who taught me that true power isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about lifting up those who need help. A man who made me believe in miracles long before we knew we were carrying 4 of them.